the Atlanta Hawks mascot makes $600,000 a year. The inequality here is absurd.
Hey guys, I'm Bill Rancic, and my new podcast, Dollar Bill, will help you build a brighter financial future for yourself and for your family. Let's get to work. So I grew up in a house with 3 older sisters. I was the only boy. My mom worked 2 jobs. My grandmother worked in a factory for Johnson & Johnson. So I watched these women work their way through college, get good jobs, try to grow. And my guest today really addresses all those issues about women, the workplace, and creating equality in the workplace. So please welcome to the show, Josie Cox. She's a journalist and an associate producer at Columbia's School of Professional Studies. She's also the author of the new book, Women, Money, Power. You know, Josie, you focus on business, workplace culture, and equality. And I got to ask you, what was the most surprising thing that you learned writing the book?
Hi, yes, Bill. Thanks so much for having me on the podcast. This is really great to be here. It's such a big question to start with, and I feel like we could spend an entire day talking about all the surprising things that I found. But really, I think it makes sense to kind of condense it down to 2 buckets. One was just how recent some of the huge legislative changes were that came into effect and that really kind of formed the basis of, the rights that we have today that women enjoy in the economy, in the labor force, that really kind of ensured that women and men, to a large extent, in the eyes of the law at least, are equals today. Some examples that I like to name, it was as recent as 1969 that Ivy League schools even started admitting women. Yeah. And it wasn't until 1974 that the Equal Credit Opportunity Act was introduced, which effectively ensured that gender was not a barrier to obtaining credit. And then, 1988, it just seems like, a few years ago, that was when the Women's Business Ownership Act passed, which effectively allowed women to finally obtain business financing without a male co-signer. So really up until that point, women in the eyes of the law, particularly in the eyes of financial law, were sort of second-class citizens. So that was something that really, really surprised me. The other thing is kind of more kind of thematic. And it's just that the book, as you'll appreciate having read it, is very much about the humans through history, the women especially through history, who have contributed to women's economic empowerment in such a large way. And so many of these names that I came across in my research are just not household names, right? They're not in history syllabuses.
Lily Ledbetter, I love that story. I couldn't believe that. That wasn't that long ago. That was shocking to me.
And the other thing is that I think a lot of us have kind of heard of Lily Ledbetter, right? We sort of know the name and we kind of vaguely know that she's affiliated or associated with, equality in the labor market. But how many of us actually know what she endured and what she went through in order to have her name on this act of legislation that has become so important?
Yeah, no, it was a great story. And if you haven't had a chance to pick up the book, it's definitely worth the read. But, historically, you were talking about just how recent many of these things are. But if you look at all the restriction placed on women in the past, it's insane. Like, they weren't allowed to own property, right? Like, that's unbelievable. They couldn't transact real estate. You couldn't take out a loan by themselves. You couldn't even open up a bank account without your husband's permission. I mean, you think about this. But right now, it's 2024. I own a company. We have a lot of very powerful women that lead our company that do extremely well. But you're in your book and your thesis, it's still not equal today. So how bad is wage equality and how much has it improved?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer to that is that wage equality is still pretty bad, and that it hasn't really moved a huge amount, at least not over the last 20 years. So depending on what source you trust, the gender pay gap in the US is still about 82 cents for every dollar that a woman earns versus every dollar that a man earns. So 82 cents on the dollar. That's roughly the gap that we're looking at. and the way that I kind of think about the state of where we are now is I tend to like this sort of metaphor of a fishing net, right? I think of the law as this kind of very large fishing net that has been cast over our economies, that ensures that women and men don't get paid equal amounts, different amounts for doing the same job, that ensures that women, for example, don't get fired for getting pregnant, which was, the case right up until the 70s. All of these things kind of get stuck in that fishing net. But it's sort of everything else. It's kind of like the microaggressions, the biases, the sort of unconscious biases, unconscious discrimination, things like that. That all manages to get through this fishing net. And so what we have is sort of a world and an economy and a labor market that in theory should treat women and men completely equally. But what we know is that obviously the culture hasn't quite caught up with the law yet. And that's why we still see gender pay gaps. We still see gender opportunity gaps. And one of the things that I talk about a lot in the book is that we still see this stage in a woman's career where she is, meant to be on this very sharp trajectory of rise. She's meant to be getting promoted. And that often coincides with a time in her life when she chooses to start a family. And therefore, it often coincides with the time in her life when she actually takes a step out of the paid labor market. And so, I think until we really start to find meaningful ways of addressing that particular conundrum, we're not really going to be able to speak of real progress.
So how do you address them? Like, I love talking about problems, but I enjoy talking about solutions more, right?
Yeah.
And that's like even with my 11-year-old son.
Right.
Don't tell me your problem. How do we solve the problem? And
right. And it's never too young to start talking about solutions, right? So there's no easy fix. I think that's fair to say. But the sort of thesis that I posit in the book is that we really have to think of this as a problem that concerns everyone, and therefore everybody has a role to play in the solution of it as well. And that starts on an individual basis. Everybody has the ability to be aware of how biases, how heuristics play into their own decisions around who they, who they acquaint themselves with, who they network with, who they favor, who they promote, who they give opportunities to, who they take job interviews with, et cetera, et cetera. On a corporate level, I think what we have to do is we really have to start thinking about how the parameters of the working world are ineffective. I think we started to kind of experiment with changing those very entrenched parameters during the COVID-19 pandemic, in that we were letting people work from home. We had to let people work from home. We were more accommodating of sort of hybrid arrangements. But I think that right now what we're seeing is a bit of a snapback to those old ways of working, coming into the office. And what we should really remember is that those old ways of working are really premised on essentially like Henry Ford's theories from 100 years ago that were not evidence-based, that he came up with and he decided this is the way we should be working. But it doesn't work for everybody, right? And if you have children, if you have caring responsibilities, if you're unable to be in a physical location 5 days a week, you're not able to be as engaged in the labor market as you might want to be. So we have to address that. And then kind of the final piece is, the individual piece, the corporate piece. The final piece that I always talk about is policy, right? I think that there are certain things that we are starting to do right in this country. Of course, we've seen moves in certain states to introduce things around policies around transparency, around pay transparency. In New York State, for example, companies now have to provide a salary range when they're advertising for jobs, which, helps to kind of level the playing field. But there's so much more to be done. We're not even talking about a gender pay gap reporting mandate, like the one that we have in the UK, for example. And then the huge one, which we just can't ignore, is childcare, right? There is so much evidence that childcare is the number one reason why people are dropping out of the labor market, why career trajectories are interrupted. Childcare in the US is not treated as a public utility the way it is in other countries. It is not affordable. It is not reliable. It is not accessible. We have childcare deserts right across the country. And if we could start to address that in a meaningful way, I genuinely believe that it would truly transform the sort of fabric of inequality in this country.
What country is doing the best job with it? What would be a good model and say, Sweden, Japan, like where is it thriving and where is the level playing field existing?
I don't think anyone's worked out a perfect solution yet. No country has managed to change close the gender pay gap in its entirety and create a labor market where gender is absolutely not a barrier to professional potential, achieving your professional potential. You mentioned Sweden. That's an example that I often come up with. Sweden has a very interesting approach to parental leave policies, whereby it incentivizes two parents in a heterosexual relationship to share parental leave equitably between the two of them. And what we've seen since that policy has been introduced is that we are seeing a higher women's labor force participation. We've seen a shrinking of the gender pay gap. And so, I think that is sort of proof of the fact that this childcare piece is so consequential for economic equality. I'd also be remiss not to mention, you can hear from my accent, I spent a lot of time working in the UK. Yeah. I spent a lot of time reporting in the UK, particularly around the time when the British government introduced the gender pay gap reporting mandate there, which was considered pretty dramatic at the time. It essentially makes sure that every company based in the UK employing at least 250 people has to report their gender pay gap on an annual basis. And what they have to do is they actually have to report it by quartile. So the highest quartile bracket, how many women, how many men, what do they make in each quartile? So it gives us a pretty good breakdown. Now, that's been in effect since 2017. We haven't seen the gender pay gap close in a meaningful way. There's been sort of like movements around the edges, as I like to call it. The pay gap certainly hasn't moved in a large way. But what it has done is it's made the gender pay gap part of the national conversation. And it's really introduced this idea of making equality in the workplace a strategic priority for corporations. It's kind of made that kind of an acceptable concept to bring up in the C-suite. And so I think that is certainly something that the US can look towards as inspiration, right?
So, the goal of this show is really to give people takeaway, right? And give them things that they can do immediately. What are 3 things that people can do tomorrow, right? Or what can I teach my son, right, who's 11 years old, so we can really make progress, right? I mean, it's easy to talk about the problem, but what can I share with my 11-year-old, that he can start helping to change his point of view? Yeah.
I commend you for asking me about your son, because I get this question a lot and people are like, what can I tell my daughter? Yeah. Right. And I think it's important to talk to daughters. Well, of course it is.
I grew up, I have 3 older sisters. I'm the only boy. My mom worked. My wife is an entrepreneur and works a lot. So, I see the world a little bit differently because, in my house, we did the dishes. I cleaned. Like there was no gap in the roles, right? Like it was just, they dominated and, I was the only boy. So, I think I have a little bit of a different perspective than probably most. And it's probably a little bit healthier or more optimistic than most. But, I have an only child. Like I want him to, grow up in a better world. I think that's the main goal here.
Yeah. Yeah. And that would probably be, my first piece of advice, which is that we have to make this gender gaps and the gender pay gap and gender opportunity gaps. We have to frame them as an issue that everybody should be concerned about, regardless of their gender. I think when we have conversations around gender, we often frame it as a kind of us versus them narrative, right? That it's like men versus women. That's not true, right? Everybody suffers from the economic gaps that exist. And as a result of that, everybody stands to benefit from us creating an economy in which economic empowerment is not inhibited by gender, right? So let's start having the same conversations with the men in our lives as we're having with the women in our lives, with the boys in our lives as we're having with the girls in our lives, and I think also, I maintain that there's a big information gap, right? Mm-hmm. That a lot of people still have a lot of misconceptions around why these gaps exist. I tell this story in the prologue of the book, which you may recall.
I do, with the CEO, the anonymous CEO.
The anonymous CEO. Yeah. Every single time I give an interview, Bill, I'm so scared that I'm going to let his name slip.
You can do it here. I mean, we're fine with that. Can you at least tell us what industry he came from?
No, absolutely not.
How can we figure that out? Come on.
Nice try. Anyway, he was a CEO of a Fortune 500 company. And it was about a year into the COVID-19 pandemic, a time when, we'd really seen a kind of reinforcement of these gendered stereotypes. Women were often taking a step out of the paid labor market in order to care for kids who weren't able to go to school because of the COVID-19 pandemic, et cetera. And I had the opportunity to interview this CEO who shall not be named. And I asked him why he thought the gender pay gap was still so pervasive and why it hadn't really moved in such a long time. And he said to me that what I had to understand was that sometimes when a woman temporarily left the paid labor market to take a maternity leave to have a child, when she came back, she's often not as ambitious as she was. And so, I mean, your reaction, you can either laugh or cry about this, right? Yeah. Both reactions are appropriate because it just seems so ludicrous that this person would genuinely think it was accurate and appropriate to place the blame for an issue that is so systemic, singly on women's choice, right?
How old of a gentleman was he? I'm just curious.
You're really trying to find out who it is.
No, but I'm just so I can put my arms up because, in some of these people who are in their 80s, it's just they grew up the Frank Sinatra era. Like they grew up a little bit differently and it doesn't age well. You know what I mean? Like their philosophies in life don't really age well.
Yeah. But even if he was in his 80s, he wasn't in his 80s. Even if it was in his 80s, because of
I'm not making excuses.
No, of course,
yeah,
I know.
Yeah.
But even if you are a person in a position of power who has the power to shape a corporate culture that doesn't only affect the lives of the tens of thousands of people within your organization, but also has a knock-on effect on the culture of other organizations within your industry and beyond. It's your responsibility to keep with the times, right?
Yeah, no, I think, for me, and I did a little bit of digging into this when I knew you were coming on. I am very optimistic because if you look at the gender of people going to college, women are outpacing men, right, who are enrolling in college. Advanced degrees, there's more women in graduate school and beyond than men. So if you look at the runway ahead, I feel like this, and maybe I'm wrong, I'm not an expert on it like you, but just doing my due diligence and kind of the data would suggest that this tide is going to turn, and it's going to turn relatively quickly because the gap is changing, right? There's a lot more highly educated women coming out of school than there are men. Not a lot more, but the numbers are definitely in the women's favor.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about college and higher education is that women actually overtook men a while ago. This was way back in the 90s that women started outpacing men in terms of finishing four-year college degrees. What we haven't seen as a result of that is that the trajectory of women's careers is able to keep pace with men's careers. And again, I think, the big thing there is childcare, right? What we see is that when you have a man and a woman in the labor market, their career generally tracks up until a point, right? And it is that point when they start to have a family, start to have kids, where time becomes more of a precious commodity, and you have to start making these decisions about whether you want to, outsource all your childcare. Fine, some people have the privilege to do that and want to do that. In which case, maybe it's going to be less of a drag on your professional trajectory. But in the vast majority of cases, one person in that relationship, if it's a heterosexual relationship, has to make this decision, has to make this compromise between professional success and personal satisfaction, between being a present parent or, being that person who is always available in the office. And because of the inequities that already exists, because of that status quo that exists, more often than not, it is the woman.
Yeah.
So it's sort of this self-fulfilling, reinforcing cycle, I suppose, right?
I mean, I've got a lot of buddies, and this is in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
The roles are, and it's probably not at a great enough number, but I have a lot of buddies whose wives are the primary breadwinner, and they're the primary caretaker of the children. So, it's definitely, I think, heading in the right direction. But I've got a viewer question for you.
Yeah.
Hi, Bill. I'm Eleanor from Colorado. I have a 13-year-old daughter. What can I do now to give her the skills needed for a more equitable future for her in the workplace?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Thank you, Eleanor from Colorado. Another place I've never been to and fully intend to go to.
Amazing.
So
It's one of the greatest places on earth.
So, I'm going to answer this question regardless of whether Eleanor has a daughter or a son. I think this advice, goes for either. But I think the most important thing as a parent is teaching your child that they are responsible for their own happiness and their own success, right? Nothing is guaranteed, but also that they do have non-negotiable rights, right? The right not to have to contest with gender as a barrier, regardless of whether that's in an institution of higher education or whether that's in a workplace or whether that's in a school. They have the right to reach their potential, regardless of what gender they are and also what gender they identify with, right? They should have the right to study and to work and to earn money in an environment that feels safe, that feels free of discrimination, in an environment that does not tolerate bias, right? And as a parent, I think that you can instill in your children, the words and the language and the means to speak up for themselves in a respectful way. I think that generally we're actually quite bad at communicating, particularly when we think about workplaces, when we think about how many people don't enjoy their jobs or feel like they're being discriminated against or not being treated fairly in the workplace. It can actually be hard to find the right words to communicate that and to have that dialogue and that conversation to kind of resolve those conflicts. So I think that all of us can do a better job of sort of, refining that skill and coming back to those common values.
And what about in a marriage, right? In a marriage, you talk about, the and I'm going to paraphrase, but like the big money and the little money decisions, right? How, the woman can go pick out the detergent and, all the grocery shopping, but the men are making the big money decisions. Like, how do we, is that by choice? Like in my house, my wife has no interest whatsoever in the financial investing, the things we do. She doesn't want to do it, and I'm okay with it. But I also do the shopping and everything else too. So it's a little bit of a different relationship. But for those women in marriages, how do they take on a bigger role so they're involved in the big money decisions, as you say?
Yeah, I mean, this idea of big money and small money, that was like a mind-blowing moment when I first learned about that. And that's that's terminology coined by an incredible professor at Princeton named Viviana Zelizer, who has really made this her life's work, studying the sociology of money and how kind of gender factors into all of that. And as you say, she makes this assertion that big money has always been the domain of men. So as you say, like investing, mortgages, buying a house, trading, whatever it is that involves kind of thousands of dollars. And then small money, as you say, is kind of like household expenditures, incidentals, these sort of things that day-to-day stuff. And the way that I think about it is that the small money, right, the grocery shopping, the school tuition, if you send your kids to private school, whatever it is, that sort of is kind of like related to unpaid labor, right? It's related to kind of the care economy and care work. And so that makes perfect sense to me. Now, to answer your question, how do we de-gender those terms? It's culture, right? I think it's not going to change overnight, that's for sure. And every household is going to be different. Every couple is going to be different. But I think, success would be a marriage in which a woman can have exactly the same amount of say over investment decisions of the household as a man can. That she feels empowered to talk about how savings and how kind of household budgets should be allocated. Just that, removing that stigma, right? Of making money a gendered domain. I think we're so beyond that now, and we should really be able to kind of dismantle those nasty stereotypes.
So, speaking of the gender domain and just Caitlyn Clark has been in the news a lot. I know you've been quoted talking about her. She's the highest scorer in college basketball history. I mean, she had record ratings for the NCAA tournament, yet her contract was $340,000 or something like that, right? I mean, it was not a lot. Yet in the NBA, 4-year, $55 million deal. I mean, it's a whole different ballgame. Now, there's a lot of other factors, right? I mean, you got ratings, right?
Yeah.
It's a lot of the WNBA has been not obviously performing at the level the NBA does, and eventually it will catch up. And I think this is going to really help ignite that fire because it was really exciting to watch. But what do you give us a little bit of your thoughts on that and the narrative?
Yeah, I never thought I'd become such an expert on the economics of basketball.
Yeah.
And I'm not. I'm far from that.
Yeah.
But it was so striking, that the headlines were hard to ignore, particularly from kind of my vantage point in caring deeply about economic inequality. So as far as I know, so from the WNBA contract, the numbers that you cited, Clark will earn a salary of $76,000 this year, right? So that is just for this year. Not bad for right out of college, right?
No,
I mean, I certainly would have figured that was my money straight out of college. But I did some calculations. It's about 7% of the salary that will be earned by the top pick for the NBA, as you say. And then absurdly, I don't know if you saw this Newsweek article, which kind of put it all into context for me. Apparently, the Atlanta Hawks mascot, Harry the Hawk, makes $600,000 a year. Okay. The Chicago Bulls, Benny the Bull, great name, makes $400,000 a year. So when you start to think about it like that, it's absurd, right? And that is a nice way of saying it. But what I think is important to understand here is that this is not about outright discrimination in this particular instance here and now. This is sort of the accumulation of historically unequal infrastructure, I guess I'm going to call it, right, between the women's and the men's sport, and this sort of asymmetry that has existed for a really long time in the deals that have been structured that inform how much revenue generated by the sport goes directly into the players' pockets. So the inequality here is a product of legacy, right? It's the result of a history of women's sport being marginalized, being downplayed, in some cases just being ignored completely, right? And that attitude towards women's sport has for decades been deemed totally acceptable. But of course it no longer is. And we can't absolve ourselves of the responsibility to address it and to talk about it and to start fixing it, especially, I think, when we have cases like Caitlyn Clark that make it so egregiously obvious. I mean, the whole mascot thing is like, it's embarrassing, It's embarrassing. So I think it's important to appreciate this is not an act of discrimination that's happened this year.
No.
But it doesn't make it acceptable, right?
But I think, and I'm just taking the, both sides of this. If I'm a team owner of the WNBA and my pool of money is so much smaller than the NBA, because I'm not getting the $1 billion deals for TV, the naming rights of the arena, which I hopefully will come in time. Yeah. But as an entrepreneur, as a business owner, you can't pay her $55 million because the money's not there, right? I mean, it just doesn't exist. So I don't think it's intentional discrimination on. It's a matter of how do we fill the arenas? How do we sell more merchandise? How do we get better TV deals, right? So we can, have more money to deal with in that pool of money to pay to the players, right? I think that's what it's all about.
And I think ultimately what we are seeing is that the tides are shifting, right?
Yeah, which is good, right? The world's looking brighter, and for Caitlyn, she's going to be fine. Jake from Allstate was there when she was the number one pick. So she's getting $20 million from Allstate, probably, another 30 or 40 million from Nike. So I'm not worried about her, but it's the people that are in the downline there.
But I think she has done us a great service by highlighting, as I say, kind of like the infrastructure inequity, right? That has historically existed, be it in basketball or soccer or wherever, right? That we have culturally just in the past not treated women's sport as mainstream sport. And I am hopeful that people like Caitlyn Clark will play a significant role in fueling that change and creating that progress so that we do have these big kind of commercial deals. We do have these revenue dollars flowing into, WNBA teams in the same way as they have always been flowing into NBA teams.
I often wonder, what would have happened if World War II never happened, right? And Rosie the Riveter. I'm just curious. I'm just curious as to your thoughts. Isn't it crazy how one event obviously it was a horrible event, but it made the world a much better place as a result, right? I mean, don't you think?
That's quite the segue from Caitlyn Clark.
But I'm just free flowing here.
You do you.
Because if it wasn't for World War II, right, we wouldn't have women in the NBA, right? It was this evolution that occurred, right? So I'm just like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I guess I'm trying to overthink this a little bit, but.
No, I'm totally with you.
Yeah.
And, that's the reason I start this book with World War II, right? I'm sure that's what you're getting at here.
Yeah.
That was the time of this huge experiment out of necessity of what would happen if we encouraged women and allowed women to do the jobs that were previously reserved for men, right? And what we saw was that, wow, like, who would have thought women can do the jobs that were reserved for men? Mm-hmm. Women can do manual labor. Women can crawl inside the wings of aircraft and rivet the little, whatever, I forget the terminology, but make the aircraft, right? Just as well as men could. In some cases better because they were smaller, so they could be more nimble. So, that is definitely a period in history that was so important, so revolutionary, I guess, right? In terms of gender norms in the economy. But what makes the subsequent period so depressing is that despite the fact that we had all this evidence that women could partake in the paid labor market to the same extent as men, everything kind of snapped back to how it was at the end of the war, right? And all of this evidence was deemed less important than cultural gender norms, which for whatever reason sort of were deemed stronger and more kind of more important than this very kind of black on white fact that actually if women partake in the paid economy, we all do better, right? Ups and downs, and that is why the subtitle of the book is The Rise and Fall of Economic Equality, because that's what we.
It was an interesting read, and there were so many great stories like Rosie the Riveter and Lily Ledbetter. Like who was the one that inspired you the most, or which story did you enjoy the most?
I love this question. Thank you. So there were two women who, I said right at the beginning of this conversation that I was so surprised that so many of the women were not household names. They're kind of totally obscured by history, not even written out of history, but never written into history in the first place, right? And the two that really stood out for me were, one was Katherine Dexter McCormick, who was this woman who was born at the end of the 1800s. And long story short, she effectively single-handedly provided all the financing for the research and development into the first oral contraceptive that was available in this country in 1960. She was amazing. She had a very, very kind of life that was stranger than fiction. I write about how before contraception was available here, when it was very restricted as a result of the Comstock laws that are now being discussed in relation to all kinds of Supreme Court cases, she traveled to Europe. She pretended to be a medical supplies buyer, and she bought all these diaphragms in France and Germany, and she ripped open the linings of her coats and dresses and she sewed them inside. And she smuggled them back into the US, and she distributed them to women who wanted to be able to control when they got pregnant, So, just like an entrepreneur, like the innovation that it takes to come up with that idea and to pull it off is truly remarkable. And she's not really known at all. And the other person who I have to highlight is Pauli Murray, who I write about at length in chapter 3 of the book. She was this magnificent Black legal scholar, activist, civil rights activist, who was one of the first Black women to be hired by a white shoe law firm in New York. She crafted a lot of the thinking and the legislation around a lot of the civil rights laws that we now depend on. And she was a mentor to the late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She was a lifelong friend of Eleanor Roosevelt, and Roosevelt really, credited her with being a sort of strong moral compass of this country, and for really advocating not only for women and not only for Black people, but really for that intersection as well, and acknowledging that intersection. And again, she's sort of known, but not really known. There was a documentary a few years ago that kind of brought her into the spotlight, but her legacy is so obscure in many places. And I just hope that through writing this book and through shining a light on her life and on her achievements, I'm doing a little bit to kind of correct the narrative and give her the credit that she deserves in this whole conversation about women's economic empowerment.
Well, I actually enjoyed it. I mean, I think it's as a man with 3 older sisters and a lot of powerful women around me who've done quite well. It was really fascinating for me to read, and it was interesting to see how far we've come, but yet how far we still have to go. And before you go, I want to say, is there 3 things you can tell our viewers that will help impact their financial lives, right? I mean, people are tuning in because they want to have a better life. They want to have, financial freedom. They want to make their world a little bit better. And what are 3 things people can do tomorrow to, make their world better financially, in your opinion?
Yeah. The most important thing is that education and literacy is agency, right? So educate yourself about your finances. Educate yourself about the way that investments might benefit you or might, be advantageous. Of course, educate yourself about the risks as well. But, money, the reason the book is called Women, Money, Power is because money is a gauge of power, right? Because this is capitalism. So that's the way it is. So the way that you can empower yourself is by understanding your money, understanding how far it can go, understanding that you are entitled to it, right, in the labor market. And so, that would be my big takeaway. That being said, I'm not a financial advisor.
No. We won't hold you.
Stock tips.
You're not giving stocks. Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, that knowledge is power. And if you can understand and really dive in and surround yourself with good people, right?
Totally.
Because I think that's very important. So, Josie, I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for writing this book. I'm going to actually bring this home to my mom.
Wonderful.
But it's available in bookstores everywhere. I'm assuming on Amazon, anywhere else they can go to get the book, Josie, that you would recommend?
Anywhere that sells good books. Support independent booksellers, but other bookstores are available too.
Awesome. Thanks, Josie. Appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.